Hey everybody, welcome to the Briefing Room. I'm ABC's Devin Dwyer on this Wednesday. Great to have you with us here on ABC News Live. A busy day here in Washington as the Trump administration just a few minutes ago announced the latest statistics from the southern border, the center of so much debate in this town. Take a look at the numbers. They are record-setting, according to the Department of Homeland Security and Customs and Border Protection. On the southern border, there has been a 300% increase in the number of family units apprehended at the border. That's an all-time high. 36,000 families coming to between ports of entry on the southern border as they're apprehended. As you see there, also more than 6,000 unaccompanied children coming in, all told. In the past month alone, 66,000. It's set up what is really a humanitarian crisis in addition to a security crisis. Children with their parents going and put into custody. Six in fiscal year 2016 died in U.S. government custody, which is a tragedy in itself. And you may recall the case of 7-year-old Jacqueline Call of Guatemala, who died in December in Customs and Border Protection custody. There you see Jacqueline. She had crossed the border near Antelope Wells, New Mexico, a remote, isolated area about 170 miles southwest of El Paso, Texas. You see it there on the map. And that is the home district, congressional district of our next guest, Congresswoman Xochitl Torres-Small. She's also chairwoman of the House Homeland Security Oversight Committee. Great to have you with us, Congresswoman. Thanks so much for being here. Want to get your reaction to these numbers just coming in. Pretty striking. And why do you think they're skyrocketing?
Well, this is part of an ongoing trend that we're seeing when it comes to the changing demographics of people who are at the border. Instead of seeing single men who are often coming from Mexico and trying to evade detection, we're seeing more families that are voluntarily presenting at the border. And as we see this increase, the big question is, how do we make sure that CBP is an agency that can adapt to these changing circumstances in a way that allows us to continue to enforce the law, make sure that we are prioritizing border security, and also reflecting our values when it comes to making sure that agents, that communities, and that children and their parents are safe.
Are you confident that we're prepared for this influx, which doesn't seem to be abating?
We're having a hearing tomorrow with Secretary Nielsen, and one of the questions is, how have you worked to make sure that you have resources in the right place to become increasingly flexible? And one of the important aspects of that is making sure that we have a good relationship in Congress as we work to solve these problems together, that there's transparency about the numbers, there's transparency about the changes in protocol that we have so that we can adapt to these changing circumstances.
And the circumstances are changing. Those families keep coming. The numbers keep going up month by month. Want to bring in now another guest, Erica Andiola. She is joining us from Phoenix, Arizona. She's a refugee with the Refugee and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services. It's a nonprofit group that's helping a lot of these families caught up in the humanitarian situation at the border. Erica, great to see you. What's your understanding of the current state of play with families coming across? What happens to them, as the Congresswoman just said, when they present themselves seeking asylum? What happens next?
Yeah. Well, first off, thank you for having me. But first off, there are more people who are choosing to not go through a port of entry because there's a lot more hurdles to to being able to ask for asylum. There's recent policies like Return to Mexico policy or Remain in Mexico policy, which is actually sending people back after they ask for asylum. Certain individuals are sent back. There's a lot more restrictions on how many people can actually present themselves every day at the ports of entry. And so folks are desperate at this point. There was about 2,000 people who were recently put into this old factory in Piedras Negras, Mexico, against their own will, basically. And the Mexican government was cooperating with the U.S. government to, sort of use metering, what they call metering, to see how many people can actually come in. And so all of this is causing for people to, decide to cross, in between ports of entry, which is very dangerous and which is what we don't want happening if we want to treat people humanely as they're trying to seek for a better life.
And what's your understanding of why the numbers keep going up so significantly? I mean, 66,000 individuals last month alone, record number of families, 300% increase. I think most people can understand the reasons that a lot of these migrants are seeking a better life. Many of them are very impoverished families, children, most from Central America, moving up through Mexico, showing up at the border, seeking asylum. But that's been true for years. Why now this huge influx just in the past year or so?
You know, there might be many factors. What we know is that it is a reality, and a lot of the individuals, a lot of the clients we speak to through Raíces and the work that we do, they have, you know, just really devastating stories of either violence, poverty. You know, it's going up, and it's just a reality. People migrate when their, you know, living conditions get worse and worse. They migrate, and it's natural, and it happens. Now the question is, how is the United States going to respond to this? And the answer is not a wall. The answer is not, you know, taking children away from their parents as they come in. And none of those are answers. Right now, what we need to figure out is how do we fix our immigration system, and we create ways for asylum seekers to actually have the ability to ask for, ways to be in the United States, in countries where they're not going to be harmed and where they're going to have a better life for their children.
And the care of those asylum seekers has been front and center in so much of the debate just in the past couple of months, particularly after the death of Jacqueline Call, the reports of abuse, widespread abuse in U.S. facilities. Recently at the White House, the Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen offered these assurances about what her department is doing to make things better. Take a listen.
We're doing everything we can to ensure rapid medical care when needed. But the men and women at CBP and ICE are doing the best they can with what they have, but they don't have the facilities, the resources, or the legal authorities to keep up with this crisis.
And Congresswoman Torres Small, back to you on this. You've visited a lot of these facilities that are in your district down there on the New Mexico border. How confident are you that DHS, HHS have learned the lessons from the death of Jacqueline Call and others? Do you get the sense that we're on the upswing in terms of care for these asylum seekers?
Well, so that's going to be a key focus of the hearing tomorrow, is asking those questions about what have you learned from the investigations of these two deaths and how are you implementing them. I've had robust conversations with medical experts on the border, both within the community and the rural healthcare infrastructure that is often helping address this crisis, as well as within DHS. And we have to make sure that the stopgaps that are being put in place now turn into policies to make sure that people are screened adequately when they present, and make sure that they are receiving the care that they need. And meanwhile, we have to address the larger challenges. A fundamental piece of border security is a clear and moral immigration system, and we have to make sure that our rules are clear, but also that there is a way to address this influx.
And before we let you go, Congresswoman, I was struck by an interview you gave recently, and you were talking a little bit about the wall. And you made the point that building a wall along much of the open border in your district would not solve the asylum problem because, as you said, there would have to be a small patch of land, actual U.S. soil, between the wall and Mexico, which wouldn't do anything to stop those asylum seekers from stepping foot on there.
That's absolutely correct. So I think that when we look at border security, we have to take it by a mile-by-mile analysis to make sure that we look at the time it takes to enter into another community and avoid detection, and the time it takes for Border Patrol agents to approach and to do the interdiction. But that's all for people who are trying to avoid detection. And what we're seeing now in the increase in numbers is people who are voluntarily presenting at the border. And that requires a whole different process in terms of what it looks like to interdict and then process those people who eventually may claim asylum. And that's why my focus has been, how do we make sure that this agency, that CBP, is prepared to make adjustments as they see changes in trends. We've seen this start in 2014 in terms of more families. So it really is time that we start having protocols to address this. We should be more prepared than we are.
And we know you're going to press the Homeland Security Secretary tomorrow when she comes before your committee. Representative Xochitl Torres-Small, thanks so much. It's great to see you here in the ABC News Live briefing room. Hope you'll come back and join us again, and we'll check back with you tomorrow as well. Thank you. And our thanks also to Erica Andiola joining us from Phoenix, Arizona, and her advocacy group and the work they're doing with immigrants there. Speaking of Congress holding people accountable in this White House and administration, our John Santucci is here. He's tracking the accountability front from the investigations unit. John, it's been a big week on that front. The president spouting off. We'll hear from him in a second. But where do things stand today with the White House response to all these Democratic requests for documents, 80+ individuals over the past 24 hours or so? What are you learning?
Basically, we're not complying with you. So we have about 81 individuals and business entities that have been contacted by the House Judiciary Committee. It's the first broad outreach we have seen from the new Democratic leadership up on Capitol Hill. They are asking for documents, records, emails, text messages from everybody, current, former administration officials. The president's children have also been asked. So far, we're not seeing a lot of compliance with that. Mainly this has just been submitted as of yesterday, but pulling all this information together, one of the biggest pieces of pushback we are getting is that we've already given this information over. Remember, many of these people have cooperated with Special Counsel Robert Mueller's probe. They've cooperated with the 3 other congressional investigations that have gone on the last 2 years. Now it's like we have to do this all over again.
Presumably, though, they have all the documents.
Oh, they're ready to go. Copy and paste and all.
So there is sort of a political game here going on. The president suggested as much just a few minutes ago. Here's what he had to say, his latest comments on this new offensive by House Democrats to seek accountability in the White House. Take a listen.
There was no collusion. There was a hoax. There was no anything. And they want to do that instead of getting legislation passed. 81 people or organizations got letters. It's a disgrace. It's a disgrace to our country. I'm not surprised that it's happening. Basically, they've started the campaign. So the campaign begins. So it's a shame. And the people understand it. When they look at it, they just say presidential harassment.
Presidential harassment, the new slogan. Catherine Faulders joins us as we look at this statement from Sarah Sanders. Catherine, not just the president, but his press secretary, his campaign press secretary, his allies on Capitol Hill, all using this line now. It's a coordinated pushback effort we're seeing underway.
Yeah, and as John and I have also been reporting, we have expected the president to go on the attack since the beginning of these investigations. We knew he was going to use that word, presidential harassment. We've seen his allies on Capitol Hill echo that, Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham. So it's pretty certain that we're still going to continue to hear this language, not only from the president, but from the White House. But that was an extremely fiery statement from Sarah Sanders. The Trump campaign also released a similar one. But what it does tell us, if that's any indication of if the White House is going to cooperate or how they're going to respond to all these requests, we can expect to see a lot more of that, Devin.
And we did see something concrete today, John Santucci, where the White House actually sent its first letter responding to a House Oversight Committee request saying thanks, but no thanks.
Yeah.
We're not responding. Here's that letter. The committee has failed to point to any authority establishing a legitimate legislative purpose for the committee's unprecedented and extraordinary intrusive demands. This is a letter in response to a request for security clearance information.
So now this is a separate investigation. So the House Judiciary Committee is 81. This is the security clearance question. So this is really bouncing off the New York Times report from last week about memos related to Jared Kushner that apparently General John Kelly wrote that he was ordered by President Trump to override the experts and the team at the White House and grant Jared Kushner a top security clearance. Quite stunning, if true. The president said on record to the New York Times in late January that he did not do this. Ivanka Trump told ABC News that her father made no special exceptions for her or her husband. But now we are seeing that this is a White House that's going to have to go back and review everything over the last 2 years with Democrats on control.
And Kate Shaw joins us as well for the conversation, our legal analyst, Kate, and also a former White House counsel herself. Kate, it does seem like the White House here is sort of gunning for a subpoena fight. They want this to land in court.
Well, I think that so far they are acting as though they're not interested in sort of the ordinary negotiation and accommodation process that typically follows a document request like this. You know, that's what happens. A big, broad request or 81 big, broad requests are sent out, and then negotiation ensues, and the requests get narrowed, and some documents are turned over, and some are withheld. And sort of slowly you kind of get to a resolution that everyone can live with. And so courts are actually almost never brought in to resolve these kinds of disputes. So there actually isn't a whole lot of case law on sort of which principle, either the Congress's a legitimate oversight prerogative and the president's legitimate executive privilege prerogative, which one has to give to the other if they're in conflict. But it seems to me quite likely that we're going to face at least one and probably many judicial battles about just that question, probably before too long.
And Kate, you served in the counsel's office during the Obama administration. The president said today that he said a similar thing happened during President Obama, and Obama never responded to Congress. He said they didn't do a thing when they got document requests. Is that true?
I'm not sure what he was referring to, but there were always responses from the White House. So, you know, it is true that there was one in the late Obama administration. There was a very pitched battle with Congress over investigations into the Fast and Furious operation at the Department of Justice, which did result in a subpoena and Attorney General Holder being held in contempt of Congress. So some of these fights, you know, did proceed and did end up in court, although that never went beyond the district court level. But it's absolutely the case that every White House initially resists broad requests from Congress. But it's also the case that historically every White House has ultimately cooperated to some extent. And so it'll be interesting to see how they proceed beyond just the rhetoric of today.
And this White House had anticipated this, John Santucci. They have been mobilizing for months before this very juncture this week.
And remember, they had a big change at the end of last year. Don McGahn, the White House counsel, stepped down. Many of the individuals that he brought with them from his former law firm, Jones Day, had left with him. Almost 40 people exited the White House counsel's office. Pat Cipollone, the new White House counsel, has staffed up, brought a lot of individuals with past experience and oversight. And take a look at this graphic here, just to explain how this is going to work now for the Trump world and what they're going to have to deal with. What they're looking at is that it's going to be 3 different entities that are going to have to respond to contacts from Congress. The first one is the presidency. That is the White House counsel's office. So that is Pat Cipollone, anything to do with the actual functions of the job of the president. The second one is going to be Trump's personal attorney. So the actual president.
Giuliani.
Correct. The president, the man, the individual. So Rudy Giuliani, Jay Sekulow, Jane and Marty Raskin, the federal prosecutors, foreign prosecutors that are helping them. They're the ones that are going to have to deal with specific questions about the president, Donald Trump, the man. The third, considering the president that we have here, this man has a very big company, the Trump Organization. So there is a full legal team that's been assembled. One of the former White House ethics lawyers has joined that team. They are bracing for a big battle. And the difference also we have to remember is that anything that involves the president or the presidency, so teams 1 and 2, they could declare privilege. They could get away with blocking subpoenas. When it deals with the Trump Organization, our sources have told us they are going to be forced and have to comply when they're contacted.
Now, one of the topics that they're going to be fighting over, perhaps most fiercely, is the tax returns issue of the president. He has not released any of his tax returns. Breaking with President, I want to bring in our White House correspondent, Tara Palmieri, who has some new reporting on the tax returns issue. Tara, you've learned just in the past 24 hours that Hill committees have staffed up, got teams together. They are getting ready to go after the taxes. Tell us what you know.
Well, the Mueller report was certainly a factor in terms of when they would start preparing to ask for a request for the president's tax return. But after Michael Cohen's bombshell testimony, they all feel more empowered. There's a lot of pressure from other committees for the House Ways and Means Committee, which has the jurisdiction to ask for a tax return, to start advancing that request. It's a 1-page document, 2 paragraphs, nothing crazy. But they are really preparing for the fact that they expect that those letters will be ignored. They'll have to go to district court and then the Supreme Court. They have 4 lawyers working on it right now, which isn't that many if you think about it. But it's a big
They've really
ask.
decided to pick this battle first.
Right, and it's personal tax returns that they're going after. Originally, they were thinking Trump Foundation, Trump Organization, but they think, you know what, instead of doing sort of what Nadler did, which is like a bit of a free-for-all and see who responds. They want to focus on the one thing, the personal tax returns, and if they get that, they think the others will follow. But it's going to be a long fight.
And they have to work with the Treasury Department to get the tax returns, right?
It's Secretary Mnuchin who authorizes the IRS to hand over those tax returns. I don't expect that they're going to do that very easily. He said they put out a statement saying that they'll look at the legality of it. But he has a relationship with Chairman Neal, who actually was very cautious about it. But I think he's feeling a lot of political pressure, and I think also feeling pressure from within his own panel.
And so, as you just suggested, this is likely certain to appear before the Supreme Court, if starting in federal district court. Let's go back to Kate Shaw. Kate, what legal issues will the federal courts, be looking at, assuming this whole tax returns issue lands there? What will they be considering? And do you expect it to go to the Supreme Court?
Yeah. Well, I should say that, like everybody else, I'm still getting up to speed on this statute. But just on the face of the statute, it does seem to authorize the chairman of this committee to request any person's taxes. And there's no special need in terms of a showing of any particular sort that needs to be made. It seems to be pretty straightforward. So the president is going to be probably deploying some pretty creative arguments to justify withholding those taxes. Look, there's never been any test of the applicability of the statute to a president because no president has ever needed to have his taxes requested by the Ways and Means Committee, right? They've all voluntarily disclosed their taxes previously. But just my initial thinking about it is, executive privilege, the way that the president might be able to block the other categories of documents that John was just talking about, that's about protecting the president's ability to get advice from his advisors and to think, brainstorm about creative solutions to problems without embarrassing exposure to the light of day of things that, never even amounted to any policy. And so there's all kinds of policy reasons to protect certain kinds of presidential documents from disclosure. None of that seems to apply here. So I don't know that the president is going to have very strong arguments to marshal in order to avoid this disclosure. So it may not be a very long court fight. But, again, we're all getting up to speed on this totally untested set of legal theories that are likely going to be advancing.
It's going to be fascinating. Kate Shaw, our legal analyst, thanks so much for joining us today, Kate, and thanks for your reporting, Tara Palmieri. Much more from Tara online at abcnews.com. You can read the full report. John Santucci, great to have you. But before we let you go, you're going to tell us about your new episode of the podcast, The Investigation. If you haven't heard it, fascinating new interview with one of President Trump's former personal attorneys, Ty Cobb, who, boy, he's singing from a different script.
Yeah, I think there were different choir practices that day. But so Ty Cobb, the ever-colorful former White House lawyer, has great experience across Capitol Hill, has dealt with this before. But, Ty came into this story at a very interesting time. So President Trump obviously starts dealing with all these investigations, doesn't have any D.C. lawyers, brings in a New York team. Ty Cobb enters as the White House Washington expert to help there. And as he's starting to exit, that's when President Trump gets into a bit of a tension more with Bob Mueller, and that's when he starts going on the attack. Ty Cobb exits. We asked Ty Cobb, as part of our podcast, what he thinks of special counsel Robert Mueller, who he's known for decades. Here's what he told us.
I think Bob Mueller is an American hero. I think Bob Mueller is a guy that, even though he came from an arguably privileged background, has a backbone of steel. He walked into a firefight in Vietnam to pull out one of his injured colleagues and was appropriately honored for that. I've known him for 30 years as a prosecutor and a friend, and I think the world of Bob Mueller. He is a very deliberate guy, but he's also a class act and a very justice-oriented person.
Did I hear that right? Bob Mueller, American hero?
Yeah, that wasn't Donald Trump's voice, obviously.
Is Ty Cobb still friends with President Trump?
He says he has spoken to him a little bit since he has left the White House role, but obviously a very different approach. We actually asked him about what he sees the biggest difference right now, and he said, look, I wanted to engage. I wanted to be peaceful. I didn't want to fire off on Twitter. Rudy Giuliani has a different approach.
Wow, fascinating
very
stuff.
Interesting interview.
New episode of The Investigation podcast. You can download it, subscribe.
We need 5 stars.
At Apple iTunes Podcast. John Santucci, thanks for
see
that.
you.
Great
Thank
to
you.
have you here as always. Shifting gears now back to Capitol Hill, where House Democrats have a lot on their hands, not just dealing with President Trump, but one of their own, stirring up controversy. One of 2 Muslim women members of Congress, Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, is stirring up controversy for some of her comments about Israel and Judaism. Take a listen to what she said just a couple days ago.
I want to talk about the political influence in this country that says it is okay for people to push for allegiance to a foreign country. I want to ask why is it okay for me to talk about the influence of the NRA, of fossil fuel industries or big pharma, and not talk about a powerful lobbying group that is influencing policy?
She was widely condemned for those comments, suggesting that allies of Israel and the Jewish people are pledging allegiance to a foreign power. She did respond on Twitter, explaining that she meant to question the relationship and that it's fair game. Of course, she's taken a lot of blowback from Democrats, including Republicans, and now our John Parkinson up on Capitol Hill is tracking a very unusual House Democratic resolution condemning one of their own. We think it's coming up for a vote tomorrow, John?
Yeah, that's right. There should be a vote as early as tomorrow sometime on this resolution. And what it's going to say, it's not going to name Congresswoman Omar. This Democratic text does not name her, but it goes through really the history of anti-Semitism, and then at the end it rejects that and expresses a sense of the House of Representatives to reject anti-Semitism. There's a competing Republican measure that's out there. It's unclear if this is going to come into the floor with any sort of procedural vote, but the Republican bill itself does name Congresswoman Omar and ticks through some of the actions that she's taken, and also the other women that is elected, Rashida Tlaib, who had some comments earlier this year that were controversial.
How widespread is the condemnation, both publicly but also privately? Are people distancing themselves from Representative Omar, even in the hallways of the Capitol behind the scenes, or is this mostly just a public show of condemnation?
Yeah, it seems like a veiled rebuke of what the Congresswoman has done here, since it does not name her. But this is very unusual that the Democratic leadership is bringing this resolution to the floor, given the timing on how all this has gone down over the weekend. One thing that we haven't mentioned about Congresswoman Omar is that she appeared on a poster at the West Virginia GOP state convention this last weekend that tied her, excuse me, to the 9/11 September terrorist attacks. And so, I think she was, pushing back against that. There's been people that have gone out to her defense, whether it's Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez or Congresswoman Nita Lowey. But Nita Lowey then said, look, it doesn't go both ways. You have to be able to stand up for both. Don't perpetuate stereotypes against Jewish people, but also you have to defend members against the Islamophobia that they're facing.
And I guess one last litmus test for Democratic outrage, John, is whether she'll lose her seat on the Foreign Relations Committee. Republicans are adamant that she be kicked off the committee. Is there any indication that would happen?
Yeah, Congressman Lee Zeldin from New York, he's one of two Jewish House Republicans. He's calling for her to lose her seat. There were calls a couple weeks ago in mid-February for the Congresswoman to lose it. And Speaker Pelosi at the point, said that she wasn't going to take that sort of action. I think it's unlikely that we see the Congresswoman get booted off, at least at this stage. I think that she would really have to escalate it to another level in order to lose her seat on that committee.
Alrighty, she's drawn fire for 2 comments in just as many weeks, drawn condemnation from her own party. We'll watch that vote tomorrow. John Parkinson on Capitol Hill, thanks so much. To you, thank you for watching us here in the briefing room today on this Tuesday, very busy Tuesday. Hope you would join us back here tomorrow, 3:30 Eastern Time. I'm Devin Dwyer in Washington. Hope to see you then.